Well, hello and welcome everybody. This fabulous Friday lunchtime session. We are going to try and make it as interactive and talky as possible. So unless you have lots of background noise, right, feel free to unmute your microphones now. If we have problems, then we can turn them back off, but it's really going to be a conversation. So thank you all for being here. Does anybody in this room not know me or our co-facilitators, Lisa or Timur? No?
Who is Timur?
Timur.
I don't know who is Timur.
Okay, all right. Okay. Thank
you. Neither.
Neither.
Yeah.
So
actually, I think probably there are a couple of folks that don't know me because I was a very bad EATG member. I was dodging General Assemblies for a long time. It's the only session that I'm doing on Step Up Academy, my first one actually, ever in all rounds of Step Up. So I am really a newbie.
So in that case, Timur, tell us your name, your country, and what you do.
My name is Timur Abdullaev. My country is Uzbekistan. Sorry, I spent too much time without traveling, so every time I say Uzbekistan, I feel like I want to vomit. But that's, it's just when you get stuck in one place for too long, that's probably you become allergic to the place. And I'm an activist and I'm a consultant. So, for example, the issue of criminalization is actually what I do as a consultant with United Nations Development Program. We're trying to make Eastern Europe and Central Asia a region which is right now the worst in criminalization.
Thank you, Timur, my love. So now we've got everybody. So without further ado, as you see, we sent around an agenda, and it's just a map. It's not literary. But we're going to start off with setting the scene. Lisa giving us an overview. What is the criminalization of HIV, non-disclosure, exposure and transmission? Lisa, over to you.
And having said that this is a conversation, I will now witter for a few minutes, but just to set the parameters of what we're up to here. It's a session on HIV criminalisation, and I'm going to define that, and I hope it's a definition you agree with, as using the law to regulate and punish people with HIV about their HIV. There are other forms of criminalisation that impinge on that and often run together. Criminalisation of sex workers, of LGBT people, all kinds of stuff. And that may come up during the session today in conversation, but we're primarily focusing on laws criminalising HIV transmission, HIV perceived exposure, and HIV non-disclosure. And there are two sorts of law that get used: the criminal law in most countries, and in a few countries, public health law. And for a long time, people thought that public health law might be less punitive than criminal law, but in fact, often it's less regulated and even more problematic. People have ended up in detention for years without recourse through public health law in some jurisdictions. So it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, as we say in English. There are 3 ways of using, I'm going to talk about the criminal law here primarily, but it does also often apply to the public health law. There are 3 ways of using that law against people with HIV in these situations. There's existing statutes. So for example, in Wales, where I live, and England next door, we use a 19th century law about assault. And assault laws are particularly popular, but other laws that have been used are poisoning, rape. There's anything that the law, police and lawyers thought they could use against people with HIV for behaviour they didn't like or didn't approve of, they will try and use. In some jurisdictions, there is HIV-specific law, and that is dangerous in a different way. Existing statutes are very woolly, and often interpretable in very wide and strange ways, but HIV specific laws can often be very draconian and were often passed at the height of the moral panic around HIV and fears about transmission, so they can be extreme. And the third way that the law is used, and this gets a lot less attention, but is actually often a problem, is using HIV as an extra punishment in other kinds of cases. So using it to disproportionately sentence someone because they're seen as more of a threat in things like ordinary assault cases because they have HIV, and that is perceived as a threat of transmission. Now, often those laws were created in fear, and it's very difficult to repeal them because they're quite popular with politicians, very popular with the media quite often. And that can be difficult. They can be laws about actual transmission. Again, Wales, where I live, and England, only actual transmission is prosecutable, and you have to prove that person A was the person who gave the virus to person B. Often it's transmission and perceived exposure. Scotland, or where I live, is like that. A number of countries are like that. And the third way is simple non-disclosure. And not so much in Europe, but in a lot of states in the US and a lot of other countries, simple non-disclosure, even where there is absolutely no possibility of transmission, is still something you can be prosecuted for. Almost all of the laws that are used and almost all of the cases that are brought are based on an outdated understanding of HIV, and that's often encouraged by adversarial court systems. It's the job of prosecution for the worst possible case against the person who is being accused, and that often leads to claims of harm being exaggerated. Women complainants saying that they can never have a family now, lots of other factually incorrect things, and that's being countered now by U equals U, by the knowledge that being on treatment can make people non-transmissible, but that is challenged in some jurisdictions and not well understood in others. And the impacts that has are, there's a real fear of unfair prosecution for people with HIV, and there's lots of evidence of that, lots of evidence of the fear, but also lots of evidence that that actually happens. It's incredibly random who gets prosecuted, and it's just bad luck or mischance in most cases. There's a real fear of disclosure, and although people who are in favour of criminalisation often say it will force people to disclose, actually we have plenty of evidence that it does the opposite. It stops people from disclosing. It induces a fear of testing. Now, that's actually something which is often the main claim against criminalisation, but there's very little evidence for that, actually, when it comes down to it. It's a popular claim, but it doesn't hold a lot of water. But there is very strong evidence for the impact of stigma around criminalisation and the way it's reported in the media and the way people with HIV are characterised as, people who are a threat is very, very difficult and a very big impact. The media coverage maintains a lot of the popular misconceptions because they're chasing clickbait, they're chasing headlines, they're not worried about public health messaging. Now, there's a lot of activity against criminalisation. Julian's already talked about HIV Justice Worldwide, and that is managed by an organisation called HIV Justice Network, which I'm the chair of and Julian works for. There are a lot of countries now working on trying to make criminalisation less problematic and only used where it is appropriate, and that's a very restricted number of cases. There are a lot of different ways of working on it, and some of the materials we're recommending to you later on are some case studies about different ways it was tackled in different countries in Western Europe. And you can aim to abolish the law, or you can aim to restrict the law, and both of those have different good and bad side effects. So, what you do in each country has to be a decision based upon your legal system, your public response and the way that you handle media and politicians as to which of those is a better goal. Because the justice system is flawed. We all know it's flawed in every country. It's never perfect. It's often incredibly poorly informed about HIV and absolutely not up to date. And that includes the people who are called to defend people accused of criminalisation offences. We often find that public defenders haven't got a clue what they're dealing with and can give very poor advice. And the justice system is punitive. It's not restorative. It doesn't make things better. And my experience over many years of these cases in the UK is that it actually, it can often damage everyone who's involved, the complainant as well as the person they're complaining about. It's traumatic for both sides. Some HIV organisations have been traditionally reluctant to engage with the issue. They only want to represent nice people with HIV. They don't want to get involved with villains, as the public perception sometimes has people. They often feel unskilled, and that's fair. I think the law is a very difficult area to dip into if you're not an expert, and it uses a lot of language, which is worse than the way that the early days of HIV used to use incredibly long words to keep out patient advocates. The law uses incredibly long and obscure phrases to keep out ordinary people. And some HIV organisations actually worry about their popularity and public sympathy. And I had that experience in when I was working in England with my organisation, which didn't want to touch the topic initially because it thought that it would make it harder to fundraise, among other things. And there are the human issues. As I've said, both sides often get damaged by this. There's a lot of police coercion of people to be witnesses for the prosecution. There's often a long wait for cases to come to court, even when they're ridiculous and have absolutely no grounds. And that is used, certainly in the justice system I come from, as a form of punishment in itself. Drag the case out, make people feel bad, because even if you can't get a conviction, you'll have given them a lot of grief. And there's a real impact on the complainants. And all of those things are reasons why I got involved in tackling criminalisation, because it has an impact beyond the number of actual cases that get brought, or even just the law being used as a threat. Now I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to encourage other people to actually talk about the experience that you have, if any, of criminalisation in your country and your organisation. What have you had to deal with?
So the floor is now open. Who wants to jump in? What is your view on criminalisation? Do you know what the law is in your country? Has it been a big issue in your country? The floor is open.
Hello. And maybe part of the question should also be like, did you have any exposure to this topic before? Maybe instead of like introducing, because probably introducing yourself at every session would be really not nice, but like maybe one way of introducing yourself, you could say like, did you actually have any exposure to this matter of criminalization at all in your country or otherwise?
We had our Amsterdam Polish person who had, and Gregoris, and also just start. It's an, let's don't be polite.
So I mean, I can say like for me, for me the notion of criminalization has become, or like I started to understand it, let's say, more. In 2018, during the AIDS conference, I was sending to Julian this text about, or just like information about the performance from Canadian artist and activist Mikiki. And, for me, I am like, as some of you know, I work as an artist and I work with HIV as a kind of productive and topic for myself. But anyway, so for me, like to understand this particular performance that Mikiki has done is super interesting because it was realized together with Alexander McClellan, who some of you may know. So this was very interesting and very powerful for me, like intersection, because Alexander has analyzed almost all the cases of criminalization in Canada and kind of build a language in order to decipher them, to present how media have been presenting these cases. But also, like, this is a project of, you know, two positive people from different backgrounds in a way. So this intersection was super important and interesting. So I saw the version of this performance in Amsterdam. And what I was saying to Julian and Marina, like last year, in November, once it was still possible, we've done like a Polish version of this performance, because I'm running a research platform and one of the public institutions in Warsaw that is concerned with, let's say, activism, social justice, and like public discourse and within, let's say, culture. So we're trying to, so we've decided during this platform to make criminalization and kind of idea of decriminalization of HIV in Poland something to study, something to learn, and something to, react to. So the trigger to it while we were designing what this AIDS platform should be about, also what's coming from how can we also engage in the present of HIV? But the next question, like, okay, so what is also the past in the context of Poland? Because I don't think we know a lot yet, or like the public does not know a lot. So the trigger for the criminalization topic was the change in the law in April 2020, that like the punishment was extended or enlarged for transmission of HIV, and there has been not really any justification for that. It came through alongside the, like, let's say, the COVID-19 package of different ideas. So let's say that this conservative government was implementing. One reading of it that I could tell you that was like, we think is that this is an influence of Orthodox Christian organizations and lobbying. This is what we kind of sense, that, and it's purely symbolic in a way, because this law in particular in Poland is not really much applied, and this is also a question. This is what we try to decipher these days, like how to actually get to know how many cases in full were there, because there were only few cases that have been really public. One in particular of Cameroon-born person who have been prosecuted and died in prison in 2008. But this is a larger of the conversation than of Polish culture, blackness, periphery, lots of things to it. But yeah, so like, just to maybe sum up, I don't want to talk to take the floor too much, but the problem is, and this is, let's say, this drive that we had, that not many or barely any, only one organization in the HIV world in Poland have reacted to this change of the law. Only one of them. So, and we honestly don't really have HIV activism as we understand it in Western context. This is something to be built. So this is the ground floor. We are working from, I would say, working from a very starting position. At the same time, of course, this is, there are a lot of people in the field, people who work mostly in the first sector. Many of them were implementing, and many of you implementing, like, I don't know, treatment, advocating, kind of on a governmental level. Like, we kind of live in like a long shadow of the 90s. This contract has never been much revised, and there's not much of, kind of, honestly, HIV and AIDS have never been made socially significant in Poland, and this is why, or like has been even obscured, I would say, in past 15 years. So EU equals you is not, for example, a message in this country. So, there's like a web of problems around it, and that's me.
Thank you, yeah. Moving swiftly on, any responses to that, or the same thing about things in one's own country?
I can only add to what Szymon has said, that the only time when I was facing let's say the problem of criminalization was the conversation with my physician when I started the treatment, and she told me and she advised me on what I should do, what I shouldn't do, and she told me, for instance, that whenever I would be dating a guy who would be negative, even though I would be undetectable and untransmittable, I should bring the guy to the outpatient clinic together with me, so that she witnesses him, and in case he gets infected in the future, so that he doesn't bring me to the court and so on. Because this used to happen to her. She was a witness in the court when one guy accused another one, and that's just some. Yeah, I'm adding something to what Szymon has said about this penalization law. And then in my volunteering job, when I meet the guys who are just at the beginning of the treatment, this is an ongoing question that appears. Should I tell, or do I have to tell? And whom do I have to tell just to be safe, and that's not a very straightforward answer to this.
Tell me, is in your criminal code, is there this clause that basically when your partner knows about HIV diagnosis and accepts the risk, you will not be prosecuted?
I'm not sure if this is put in this way, but I would say no. So if I deliberately put someone at risks, which means someone doesn't know. Yeah, so someone is not aware that he or she would get infected from me, then I would be punished. But if someone knows, then that's already a risk that someone takes, right? So do you follow me? But
yeah. I'm asking because we have this starting wave of countries that are amending their obsolete criminal codes by adding this clause. And there are 5 countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, namely Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Moldova, who added this clause that when a partner was informed and accepted the risk, then the person should not be prosecuted, but should be not held liable.
Mm-hmm.
So basically there is no liability when this is when the other partner was informed.
I would say we don't have this clause, but I think it would be interpreted this way by the court. I think so. Yeah, that's because interpretation. But it's not written. Mm-hmm.
It's seen as actually as an advancement, and I know that in Belarus, which is they are the champions in terms of criminalization. They criminalize like maniacs, like lunatics. And the thing is, when they passed that amendment, a few people were actually they went out of prison. Their criminal record was cleaned, so it helped them. But then at the same time, what we see is there is a risk that basically people will see that clause and say like, okay, I'm informing my partner, and therefore we can have fun, and it's all gonna be fine. But the problem is when it comes to court, you have to prove that the partner was aware. Just like you said, your doctor said like, bring that guy to me, so that like there is a witness that the person was informed. Because we did have like in Belarus, there were cases when people just broke up, the family broke, and then the person would be just so upset that they would just want some revenge, and they would go and report the police. And the thing is, like, the other guy would not be able to prove, like, how do you prove? How do you prove that there was consent if there are no eyewitnesses, if you didn't write anything and the other partner didn't sign it? So there are risks. There are both pros and cons. It looks like it's still progressive. from where we are, and I will probably, if Julian allows me, I will give you a little bit of information, an overview of what is going on in Eastern Europe and Central Asia.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but this is a step forward, but at the same time, it's coming with certain risks.
But also there are two layers of security. So one is the physician who is a witness, but the second layer is that when I am on the treatment, and that's documented, that I was on the treatment from this and this time, and I was undetectable from this and this time. That means I cannot transmit. So it's not possible. So this is something that we can document. So it's already like a double security, I would say.
But of course, in an awful lot of jurisdictions, even when they have HIV-specific laws, right, the language that is used, and I've just put up the language for Poland, anyone who knowingly infected with HIV directly exposes another person to infection will be subject. Now, then you have to fight the things, and I'm sure we'll be talking about later, the expert consensus statement, what is allowed in court, the fact that exposure in and of itself, even if transmission does not occur, being an offence, right? You expose somebody to HIV, but how much HIV? What level of HIV? And I think we'll talk about that, and especially when Timur does the section 3, we'll see the stark contrast between, Eastern Europe and Western Europe.
And then also, if I may add, the thing with this informing the partner, it is about criminalization of non-disclosure, right? You don't disclose to your partner, you're criminalized for non-disclosure. So that step, when you allow people to be like to be free from liability, you're doing it by forcing them to disclose your status. And that's exactly the third component of HIV criminalization that we're talking about. So. And
absolutely, Timur, as you've told me beforehand about Eastern Europe, and it's still the case, where in some countries you have to sign a thing on when you actually that you're never ever going to have sex with anybody, right?
Except for yourself.
Except for yourself, and still, like syphilis, you have to have in a lot of countries, a certificate that you haven't got HIV before you're allowed to marry. So, it's like we can only have sex with a contract, darling.
Yeah, so contractual sex.
And it also ignores the realities of sex for a lot of people, which is that, yes, maybe that is, taking someone into the clinic with you can happen if you have somebody you want to get married to or have a long-term relationship with. But an awful lot of people are having sex not in long-term relationships. And in fact, that has been somewhere where certainly in England and Wales, we have been able to use people who are having multiple partners who inappropriately complain about the one person. Basically, when people find out they have HIV, sometimes they go back over their previous lovers. And if one of them is identifiable now as openly living with HIV, that is the person they accuse. Yet if they have had, I've had multiple cases where people have had 5, 10, 20 other sexual partners, and it could have been any of those people that the virus was passed on through. But the prosecution in England and Wales uses very poorly worded scientific statements, which basically, when you look at them carefully, say, well, A could have given the virus to B. And it took us a few cases to work out that that didn't mean that A did give the virus to B, and to get a virological expert to be a witness for the defense. And as soon as we started doing that, it trashed those statements completely. But that level of scientific knowledge, it's like expert fraud cases in court. If you don't have a lawyer who understands it, you're stuffed. And it was ironic that this misuse of scientific statements was discovered when somebody actually used an expert fraud lawyer who was used to going over the fine print, as it were. So this is why it's incredibly important to have some people who are in the law who are well educated on HIV, preferably HIV positive lawyers, who certainly exist.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a very quick question, please? It's maybe a little bit provocative, and I think I know parts of the answer, but where do you see the difference, for example, with being obliged to disclose that you are COVID-19 infected, or you cannot enter a country if you don't prove that you don't have it, or I being forced to disclose to the school of my children when I have it? Where is the nuance? Where is the line?
Well, that's a question a lot of people are asking, Peter, and it's why a lot of organisations that do work on HIV criminalisation have been monitoring laws and regulations around COVID, because while more often they are public health related than criminal law related, there has been use of the criminal law in relation to COVID. And at the moment, people are still trying to work out, I think, a lot where the fine line comes.
Yeah.
Around it, and also whether the penalties for things are proportionate, because penalties for misbehaviour around COVID can range from anything from a tiny fine through to 10 years in prison, which is being threatened to people in England and Wales if they lie about quarantine. So it's incredibly variable. One of the problems we have with HIV is that all of the punishments are draconian. We have been trying for ages in England and Wales to get people, to get the justice system to look at reducing prison sentences for HIV-related offences down to antisocial behaviour orders, because we're big on mitigation rather than reaching for abolition.
But Peter, you bring up that absolutely wonderfully in the illustrating how some of the laws around HIV, right, almost mirror the ideas around COVID, that somehow it comes out of the air, right? Because when a lot of these laws started to be prosecuted, routes of transmission were actually not known. You know, it was not known. It's a bloody difficult virus to pick up, whereas COVID is a pretty easy virus to pick up. You know, and you don't have to insert a digit or anything else into anybody else, you know, to pick up COVID. With HIV, you do. So I think that's another way of looking at it in terms of that proportionality. I'd like to, Tim, I know you won't, but I'd like to see whether our wonderful Eliane or Satiras wants to come in so that we get everybody to. You don't have to talk, but you know, it would just be nice to hear from you. And Eliane, why are you so quiet? You're not normally so quiet, my love. But we'll leave that. Timur, back to you, and then I think we can.
No, I am listening. It's very interesting. So I'm just here.
Okay, my love. Thank you. It's lovely to hear your voice. Right, Timur.
Yes. So the thing about COVID, HIV, or any other infectious disease, Lisa mentioned one thing that is really key, that the thing of popularity of certain responses. There may be enormous evidence against some measures, but then these measures will still be loved by a majority of people. And the bigger the majority, the more popular the measures will be. It was particularly the case with HIV in early years. That's why, like, what's the most, the first, like the lowest hanging fruit when responding to a threat? Well, that's basically isolate the threat, remove it, don't care about what happens to those people, you know, they are the threat. So that's how criminalization started almost immediately after HIV was discovered. And that was considered to be like, yeah, that's what needs to be done. Like everyone was like, oh yeah, put those people in prison so that they don't spread. Same thing was happening once COVID was starting. People like Tajikistan early last year, they changed their criminal code and they added things around COVID to their criminal code, so that basically, like, not just violating this quarantine measures, but also like other things related to COVID became a crime. Like, I think there was something around like non-disclosure of COVID as well, or like interrupting treatment when there was no treatment, right? So Tajikistan was very progressive, quote, and that's actually the thing. So when we were speaking about things like what we do, actually there are different ways of responding, and probably first thing, with some threats, you just need to wait. Like with COVID, once the majority are affected by COVID, those measures are not popular anymore. With HIV, we don't want that to happen, so we need to do something else. And there, probably the best thing would be to raise awareness, so that when people understand, and maybe that's why, Lisa, people, organizations are trying to put those good-looking, high-class HIV positive people, so that everyone is like, oh, we cannot criminalize them. Maybe that's just a tactic to challenge public perceptions around HIV, so that people are like, oh, actually, those people with HIV are not that scary, are not that threatening. So it's just trying to challenge those perceptions. And once those perceptions get challenged, we see that public attitudes, they swing from like really like, oh, put them in jail, to, oh, actually that can, yeah, that's a normal thing, So once people get sensitized and more aware, that's changing. But then also there is this little group of people in every society which is listening to data. And I would actually like to throw this question maybe to our participants. A lot of UN experts were saying and are saying that criminalization is proven to be not effective. Do you know how it was possible to prove that criminalization does not work? How was it possible? Like, can you think what scientific approach, what research approach? There is one research that I will give you as an example, which actually showed that criminalization does not help curb the HIV epidemic. What approach that would be? Any ideas? Yes, Julian?
No, I'm just dancing. It's after Friday afternoon, isn't it? Any thoughts, Eliane? You have any thoughts on Timur's question?
Yeah, I'm not good with the scientific stuff. So, but anyway, I think the approach, why it didn't work out, I think is to do that people just did stop being open up, being publicly open, and then so then there is no way you can get them to execute them when they are. Meanwhile, between people, they always meet. There is always infection and keep on going. So that's why it didn't work out. You can kill 10, but there are 100 that get infected that keep going. I don't know the scientific thing. I'm waiting for you, actually. I'm very curious. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on that? Or Timur, are you going to?
I had the same thought that when there's a criminalization, then people do not get tested simply. That's what I was.
But how do you measure? How do you measure?
No freaking idea.
So I will tell you. I will not torture you and be as smart as to like, oh, I know the answer. The thing is, they did a study in United States. In United States, every state has its own legislation, and some states criminalize HIV, other states don't criminalize HIV. So what they did, they looked at epidemiological trends in the 50 states, and they compared whether those trends were anyhow influenced by whether the state criminalized HIV or not, and there was no connection. So HIV criminalization proved to play zero influence on bringing the HIV epidemic down. The only decrease of HIV epidemic was connected to something that was done like at the federal level, for example, like some laws being passed, some programs being launched. But those laws that criminalize or decriminalize, they had no influence on the epidemic itself. So it doesn't help stop the epidemic. And I can share the link.
It doesn't also increase.
It doesn't increase, it doesn't decrease, it just doesn't. Criminalization, like, okay, look, in my country, there is a law. I'm a criminal. I'm exposing my wife, you know. Yes, I'm undetectable, but who cares? It's still like, even WHO doesn't say it's zero risk. They say it's negligible. They say whatever, but they don't say it's zero. And for our criminal system, zero is zero. I was diagnosed, you know. And did I stop having sex? I wouldn't be smiling if I stopped having sex. And I have 2 children and they look just like me. So that means, yeah, I did have sex at least twice, you know. But anyway, I would be a criminal. My wife is negative. My children are negative. I'm having sex and I did sign that paper. So anyway, let me give you this.
And I'll put it in the resources thing at the end. Yeah.
So that you can have a look at this study and maybe use it as scientific evidence why criminalization doesn't work. We do have a lot of articles, like 10 Reasons Why Criminalization Doesn't Work by Edwin Cameron.
Yeah.
But this is research.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the other argument that is used sometimes by activists, there are actually so few cases, aren't there? You know, why is this the big issue? But as Lisa has said beforehand, you know, for every one case, at least in the UK, you know, there might be up to 70 or 80 investigations, you know. So that is the damage it causes all the way through. And also, quite rightly, when you have a law that on the face of it, even though it might not be used, criminalizes a certain set of society, criminalizes, you know, a set of society, then it's the state turning around and saying, these are bad people. These are shameful people. These are people who really shouldn't be part of our society. And that is the stigma of saying, even if the law is not used or it's not used very, very often. So I think that's the other reason of challenging the law, because it's saying that a category of people are lesser citizens. And that feeds into, as we've already said, the thing of stigmatizing against those people, being able to discriminate against those people, and those people feeling fucking shitty about themselves, you know?
Yeah, Julia.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, this talk kind of put me back on how I escaped of the criminalization in Angola. The time I was diagnosed. So it was very hard because I have to hide every time I enter the country the medication, because if they caught me, then probably today I am already dead a long time. So because it was not allowed to have any HIV positive person in their country in Angola by then, 18 years ago. I'm lucky now. So that's why I'm a little bit amazed to hear all these stories. And so thanks.
Did it change, Eliana? How is it now?
Now it's not so bad as it was. They are now more dealing with the stigma and discrimination, but law for killing, I think, is no longer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the arguments that is often used, and Eliana, I don't know if you've come across this, is that there are often, when people are praising these laws, they talk about them as protecting women specifically, as if somehow women needed more protection than men. But I think it's a kind of traditionalist thing. But there is some very good, there is a very good paper from Africa, I think it's from South Africa, which actually explains why HIV is even more a threat. The criminalization of HIV is even more a threat to women, because often women are encouraged to bring charges. They are told they are, you know, innocent victims, and these men must be put into jail, which in itself is weird because HIV is more commonly transmitted in jail than most other settings. If you're actually about reducing onward transmission, it's not a very bright thing to do. But the argument is very poor, because when women are in the firing line, they are disproportionately criminalized. An accusation against a woman is often more heavily prosecuted than against a man. And women are far more likely to be diagnosed without their consent, as it were. I mean, I think, we are all aware that it is a good idea to test and be diagnosed, but there are far more women who are diagnosed, for instance, when they are pregnant and find out. And there are a lot of examples of, in my country at least, of men bringing inappropriate prosecutions when it's quite possible that they were the person who actually infected the woman that they're accusing. But because the woman is diagnosed first, quite often very ignorant people, including many people in the justice system, assume that the first person who's diagnosed must be the first person who had it.
And then there are also like two things that actually don't help with that argument. First of all, some countries criminalize vertical transmission.
Yeah.
And some countries criminalize when the child is positive because of breastfeeding and the risk of transmission, the exposure of the child. So basically both things. I haven't heard of one man being pregnant and giving birth to a child or breastfeeding successfully, at least. So like, yeah, you can't protect women by criminalizing exposure and transmission. If that's also exposure, and sometimes that's also how transmission happens, especially when the country doesn't make sure that pregnant women do get ARVs, when in during the pregnancy, even when they're tested positive.
That was my question. What about the therapy then, and which countries are this? Just out of curiosity.
Which countries are criminalizing? Well, any countries with stupid lawyers, and being a lawyer myself, I can tell you that a majority of my colleagues are assholes and idiots, because the law doesn't say exposing a child to HIV. No, they don't say that. They say exposing to HIV. And if a lawyer takes the law and says, okay, was that woman HIV positive? Yes. Was there a risk of transmission? Opening WHO books. Yes. Even with ARVs, yes. Little, but yes. So that's exposure. Case, so basically for a prosecutor, for a police officer, that's how things started in Tajikistan. They just realized, oh my God, these cases are just right there. We just need to get the data about all serodiscordant couples. These are the guys. This is the crowd. And what they get promotion, because every case is a winning case.
I think that's a very important point that Timur makes. Is certainly in my country, HIV prosecutions are not easy and they are really messy, but we see a lot of cases where police officers who are not familiar with this think it's an easy win. And they have their own prejudices around the issue. And one of the side effects of that is that quite often they blunder around a case. And I have had cases literally where police officers have confiscated the address book of somebody they know has HIV and have contacted everybody in that address book, or proposed to contact every single person in that address book and say, have you had sex with this person? And in one glorious case, they asked their mother because they didn't realize it was their mother. There is a lot of damage caused.
That was just due diligence. They were just making sure. Who knows? Some mothers. Oh my God!
Well, yeah, it's in England and Wales. It's called public duty, that you have a duty to protect the public, and that can manifest in incredibly inappropriate ways when the police are prejudiced, not just about HIV, to be fair, but also the law gets very inequitably used. And it's different in different countries, which I find fascinating. In some countries, sex workers are particularly prone to prosecution. In some countries, drug users are particularly prone to prosecution. In my country, it is migrants. Migrants are absolutely disproportionately, and not even African migrants who are relatively people who need support around HIV risk. It's any migrants tend to be disproportionately prosecuted.
I would like to ask you actually, like in terms of this, I don't know how to call it, cross-criminalization or But yeah, like how to view also criminalization of HIV in terms of sex work, in terms of drugs as well. Like what I know from talking with researchers that I work with in Warsaw, like in context of Poland, actually, like all those laws were like penal code was updated in the late 90s, around, and it was all updated all together. In terms of drugs, also HIV criminalization appeared at the same time. So it was kind of certain philosophy that was put together. But I'm curious, like how to, let's say, work with criminalization of HIV while we have like what other things are criminalized.
Can I
look at it together?
Yeah, can I just give you a quick example from Tajikistan? A sex worker was criminalized, actually the same way Lisa was saying. Her telephone was basically taken by police, and they called everyone on that telephone, and they found one guy who said, yes, I had sex with her. So they brought him as a witness. And when he said that he had sex with condom, and the judge said that, like, the judge was actually very progressive. He said, like, oh, if there was a condom, fuck off. But then actually that police officer started putting pressure on that guy, and the guy said, oh, actually, I remember we had sex without condom once. And that sex worker ended up in jail. Sex work is not criminalized. It's like it's prosecuted, but under like more softer laws, like you pay a fine. But that woman ended up in jail because, and police officer, of course, I mean, he's now a saint, right? I mean, he cleaned the society out of such an important criminal that woman was, you know. And she was on ARVs, she was undetectable, and they were using condoms, but probably that's not enough.
There was a very famous case in Greece, which there is a film about, whose name I have forgotten off the top of my head, but where all of this came together.
Which hunting?
Right?
Greece.
This is what I would like to talk about exactly. Thank you for mentioning that. No, yeah. You could probably know more information about it, but yeah, I can add if something.
Basically, the Athens police or the Athens municipality decided to clean up sex work in Athens, and they ended up rounding up often migrant or drug using street sex workers, and ended up forcibly HIV testing them all. Some of them were also transgender, and it was like all of the prejudices boiled into one, and there were huge rows about this in Greece, and the law and the prosecutions went to and fro for several years over this and it became very politicized. Is that fair, Sotiris?
Yeah, actually it was before the elections in 2012. And actually what happened back then is that the Minister of Health, cooperating with the police in Athens, they were actually prosecuting sex workers. What they were trying to do is to prove that immigrants bring HIV, and sort of like Greek public services, health services protect people from HIV. So it is the immigrants actually that the immigrant sex workers that bring the virus to the country. And it was a big disaster back then. I mean, it's even discussing it, it's very, very emotional, because all these women, first of all, after all, most of them were Greek, so their initial plan failed. And actually what they did is that they were showing their photos and their personal information, like where they live, what is their name, their surname, their parents' name, on the news in every single channel, including the national news channel. So their names were on TV, and it was a huge political debate back then. And most of them went to jail. Actually, what happened is when they prosecuted them and they were tested positive, they went to jail before their trial. So they had no idea that their photos were on TV, on public television, and their personal information are on TV. And many of them committed suicide. And actually, they are all free now, but none of the politicians is in the jail. There was not a specific law. There is no specific law about HIV infection, but if I remember well, they were trying to charge them for public harm, because it was very much based on, you know, discrimination, prejudice. Like, they were trying to show that these women were infected men with families, and, you know, serious men with families, and all this stuff. Yeah, there is a documentary. I can send it in English, and I don't know if you have already sent it.
Yeah, it's in the chat.
No, we'd love a link, and I'll put it in the resources.
It's in there. I'd quite like to ask people another question. We've talked a little bit about the impact of these prosecutions in our countries. A lot of people have fought against this. There are global organizations collecting all the information. We'll talk about those in a little while. There's a lot going on, but what are the tools that you can use if your organization or another organization comes across these cases? If you decide you want to work on this in your country, what are the things that help, and what are the things that hinder around that? I mean, in my country, it was incredibly important that the organization that managed the main national helpline on HIV, which was Terence Higgins Trust, started to keep records of every single case that we came across. And we recorded, I recorded effectively, I kept my own little logbook of every single case that came through the helpline or through our regional offices. And I used that to show to the prosecutorial service in England that they were wasting a lot of their time and money, because, you know, they were not really interested in listening to whether they were being unjust, which was ironic, but they were very interested in listening to whether they were wasting time and money and not actually getting anything done. And actually showing them that data over a period of time got them, it was a big part of what got them to actually make proper guidelines. And the police as well eventually made proper guidelines, because we were able to show them that the police were wasting an enormous amount of time and money on cases that never went anywhere. Is there anybody else here who can recommend things that you can do to actually ensure that when these cases happen, you can tackle them?
I mean, I'm thinking here again of work of Alexander McClelland. I mean, I was very impressed by this last publication he's made, that he had interviewed people who experienced criminalization, and their stories are known, basically. And I think this was very powerful, like to rehumanize also people who have been criminalized.
Yeah, it's much harder to demonize people if you can see what they look like and realize they're human. And I think, Timur, you were saying much the same, weren't you?
Yes. Yeah, and I can tell you, I have seen a tremendous change. As a UNDP consultant, I'm supporting the work around judges and HIV and the law. That's basically the follow-up to the recommendations of the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, which published its first report in 2012. And in response to that report, the UNDP facilitated establishment of this African Judges Forum on HIV and human rights and the law. And what they did was basically they brought these judges who, first of all, were the ones involved in cases which were progressive, like for example, the case when mother mistakenly breastfed another mother's child because the child was screaming, and then it turned out that she was HIV positive, and she was prosecuted for exposing the child to HIV. So the judge who actually ruled that the woman is not guilty was in the forum, and other judges like that. But then there were judges who were not so progressive also in the room. And when we had people coming to the room and sharing their stories of being criminalized, a lot changed in the judges' minds, and we could see, like, at the beginning they were old school judges saying, like, oh yeah, jail is perfect school, it will re-educate you, and like if you were gay you will no longer be gay after our prison, right? So they understood it was not just about HIV, it was also about key populations, and people actually realized what transgender person is all about, what intersex is all about. We had this beautiful expert from South Africa, Anastasia, who is transgender, and she's a doctor of psychology, I think. And she basically, she just smashed all those doctors, all those judges. They were like, she just completely destroyed them. They were like, you know, they were rebuilding the picture of the world after that very short intervention. Which was both a personal story and evidence-packed kind of message. So that's one thing that I saw very quickly changing people's perceptions. There's personal stories, even though we say very often in HIV now, oh, there's personal stories, like we should stop showing those people with HIV or representatives of key populations as if they were like circus monkeys or something, you know, and like, oh, go tell your story. But actually, for a lot of people, that's a very important thing to hear. They do need to hear those stories. So yeah, definitely, that's one thing that should happen. And for judges, we did the same thing in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We now have this regional judges forum in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and we are really handcrafting the vision of those judges, trying to make them champions in the judiciary, so that they become the actors of change, the ones to break the entire system. And
I think one of the things that organizations can also do, and I think, you know, Lisa is a really good example of this, is that when suddenly you're getting on with your life, you're HIV positive, and suddenly something you never thought would happen, right? Suddenly you're dragged up because you say, not only is your HIV bad, but you have committed a crime because we think you've infected somebody else. Doesn't that bring up for the individual all those things about internal shame that we might have about our own HIV status? You know, the thing of, well, yeah, it is bad that I have HIV. I am a bad person. I have done something wrong. And I think that a lot of defendants in the first instance, because of that, not because there is any proof about it, think, yes, I'm a bad person because I've got HIV. I'll just plead guilty, number one. Or number two, actually the stress of going through the case and the prosecution and the investigation, you know, needs an awful lot of support so that somebody doesn't end up feeling suicidal and shitty and terrible about themselves. Oh, well, this is my punishment for myself being homosexual. You know? This is my punishment for this, for making those bad life choices. And I think that that's one of the other things that you know, organizations need to do, because once again, in a lot of ways, HIV criminalization is a surrogate marker for what people are made to think about us by the state. Yeah, we're all filthy homosexuals. Yeah, that's why we've got HIV.
What Timur was saying about the study in the US was like, for me, was like, was shocking, like, was really like somehow important. Like, yeah, that this tool was implemented to curb the size of the pandemic. It's proven that it doesn't work. So I find this very important. Like, what is the, let's say, the reasoning, or like kind of like the utility of this law? Like, I find this like not stressed enough somehow. Like, I find it super important.
Yeah, the law is usually an exercise of the moral attitudes that society has towards certain people and certain individuals. It's not anything to do with very little to do with the facts sometimes. And I think we're going to put up later, but here is the here are the 10 things in the chat box from the expert consensus statement, which interestingly enough, and I think Timur and I had a conversation about this earlier, is that HIV Justice Network got 70 leading scientists to, to bring this on, to use as something which could help or support conversations or people who are using defenses around the world where persuasive arguments were allowed. Of course, as Timur says in some places, it's only a statement of 70 scientists.
For judges,
it needs to be something different. As you will see when you read through this, of course, there will always be the caveat from the scientist, right? That, well, nearly negligible. To all intents and purposes, we know that people on PrEP will undetectable viral load, right? 1 in 100,000 times, will a scientist or a doctor will always say, oh, there is the very, 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 very small possibility.
I can tell you that actually I heard a very good example which can help. And we had this conversation during the recent, the second session of the Regional Judges Forum, when we were discussing the zero risk versus not zero, but minimal. And we had this amazing lawyer from the Canadian legal HIV legal network, Mikhail Galichenko, and he said that, look, in most countries, we're not speaking about the states, but in most countries where weapons are not allowed, you still can have this sports rifles or like hunting rifles. You get a license to have a rifle at home and go hunting sometimes, or do sports, like it's also a sport, right? So you may have some arms according to the law. Even when the law understands, there's always a risk. There is a risk that this rifle will hurt someone, right? It's a rifle, it's a weapon. So there is a risk, but the risk is minimized by all these measures, and it's allowed. It's like allowing a person to live with HIV, understanding there is this negligible risk of injury, and that's why exposure should not be criminalized. That's why if the person has undetectable viral load, that's like completing the courses of shooting, so that you don't give a child who can't shoot, you don't give a license for the rifle to a child or to a person who is blind, for example, right? You won't, it just won't happen. So that's the thing with HIV. If you have undetectable virus, there is evidence that you have been living with HIV and you didn't really infect anybody, then why would that person be criminalized? It's like, it just doesn't make sense. And it's a very legal argument, because judges then say, yeah, true. They just take it through the different perspective. With the consensus statement, the problem is that it doesn't say it in those terms. It says the risk is minimal. The risk is 0.0 something. But the thing is, for judges, it's still like, oh, the risk is there. And they don't even think about things like, okay, you need to have sex like so many times. You will probably not be able to have in your lifetime to infect someone with HIV. Like, you have to be a fucking champion of sex to have that number of sex, that amount of sex in your life to infect someone. And then, yes, so you have to try hard, being really like undetectable, to infect someone and have sex like crazy. That's what judges don't really understand, that it's like statistically impossible. Even if it's 0.0 point something, that point something doesn't matter. So this is the thing. The consensus statement was written in a very good language, scientific language. Judges are no scientists. They don't understand it. It's a very good source of information. When it brought up by defense, I would say it's a very important tool, and it has to be brought up in every courtroom hearing the case of HIV exposure. It has to be there because it will basically be as scientific evidence, and it has to be used. But in addition to that, I want to say something which I heard from a judge, a progressive judge, who said, show me international guidelines saying that undetectable equals untransmissible. And there is no guidelines because UNAIDS endorsed this thing, the U equals U campaign, the consensus statement. WHO endorsed U equals U, it's on their website, but website is not a guideline. It's not a protocol. It's not an international standard. And the judge said like, oh, website, yeah, I can see us using a website information from the website in the courtroom. It's just not gonna fly. We need UNAIDS, UNDP, just let me finish because this is an important action point that I want to actually call everyone. UNDP wants to change it. As a follow-up to the judges forum, we agreed that judges agreed that what judges need is recent guidelines. The most recent guidelines coming from UNAIDS is as old as 2013. That's before the U equals U campaign, and it's not even, it's just a publication, and it's not available in other languages other than English. So it makes it very difficult to be used in our region, for example. And then the thing before then, there is this policy brief by UNDP and UNAIDS, which is very, very helpful because it speaks about like when you should not criminalize people for exposure and what are the caveats. But that's 2008. That's before the Global Commission on HIV and the Law. That's before everything. That's before my kids were born, right? So that's like really outdated. What we need is something new, is something strong, speaking about U equals U, speaking about that you should not criminalize exposure, reinforcing the language. Yeah. And UNDP is waiting for a call for like a request from civil society. We have judges already demanding it, requesting it. Now, the second important voice would be civil society. We are talking with GMP+, but we need more voices. So when that request is coming from civil society, UNDP, would you be so fucking kind to actually do something about it? UNDP will do something about it and will, because they are co-sponsors of UNAIDS.
I think for us as activists sitting in the room, it shows how activism is like a slow drip, because I think that this went back from, the Oslo Declaration, the Swiss statement, the consensus thing, and I put all those links, how we've started to push the needle very, very slightly and building up the body of evidence of pushing it as far as it can, so then it becomes a normality, and I think so. It's always those multiple routes through to target. The consensus statement has been used as advisory in the jurisdictions where people take that sort of evidence on when making their considerations and decisions. And I think that Lisa will tell us about the long, hard slog of advocacy, how it's incremental.
Well, I want to drag us back a little bit. I mean, that's incredibly important, that stuff you were saying, Timur. But I almost want to drag us back to the other end of the advocacy spectrum, which is when you're sat in your office in an HIV organization, or at the moment you're at the other end of a computer or a phone line, and somebody is wanting to bring a prosecution or being investigated by the police. And I just want to support the idea that you don't have to wait for this to happen for your organization or your group to actually have an idea of what you should do, because in my experience, and it is direct experience over many years, things go wrong when an organization has to think on the hoof, in the spur of the moment, about criminal prosecutions, and they make stupid decisions. I dealt with a case once where I was working for the largest HIV organization in the UK with a lot of experience, and a small group in a small town was trying to handle a case, and I rang them And I said, look, obviously you need to support your person. I'm not trying to poach your case, but can I help you about this? And they said, no, you go away. This is confidential. And I said, well, if it's confidential, what is it doing on the front page of all of the national papers with this person's face and name? Don't quote confidentiality because you're afraid I will poach your case in some way. But they were scared. They were trying to prove that they were able to handle it, and they just used a silly excuse. I've seen organizations panic and not help people because they were afraid of the bad publicity associated with it. I've also seen organizations take the opposite end of the stance and refuse to help people who came to them in distress after getting involved with the police and being coerced into making a statement for a prosecution because they would not help anyone except the person who they saw as the unfairly accused person. And I think organizations for people living with HIV need to think through that when these cases happen, it involves, unless it's purely exposure, where it is transmission, it involves 2 people with HIV at least, and maybe more as witnesses. And all of those people can be damaged if they don't get support. My organization quite regularly ended up, because we got a name for these cases, dealing with both the person who was seen as the victim by the police, but also the person who was being prosecuted, who was a victim of a different kind, because quite often partway through the case, someone who has been persuaded to bring a prosecution realizes that this is going to drag on for years, or that this is somehow unfair, or that they are suffering, and they try and back out. And in my country, the police will then try and take the prosecution without them, because they make it analogous to domestic violence cases, where they will bring a case even where usually the wife withdraws the complaint against her husband. They use that as an analogy in HIV cases to be able to continue the prosecution, even when the original complainant, who may have been coerced into that original complaint, is trying to get out of the case. I've got personal friends who that's happened to, and they feel guilty then because they have realized the damage that they're doing. So it's really important that organizations think through what they're going to do about these cases, how they're going to handle them, and get some idea of how it's been handled elsewhere, because otherwise you can end up making some fairly, in human terms, some fairly expensive mistakes. Sorry, that was a bit of a peroration. I'm just very keen that organizations think this through in advance. Think about how you would handle it.
And how they deal with both sides of the argument. We've often and how
we've had to do everything from dealing with both sides of the case through to actually persuading people to change their lawyers, because quite often an inexperienced defense lawyer will give you very bad advice. And in some cases, we've dealt with defense lawyers who were clearly colluding with the prosecution because they disapproved of what their client had done. People have been given atrociously bad advice, and people have ended up in jail when we examined the cases a few years later in the cold light of day. The prosecution service actually agreed with us that they should never have been prosecuted.
Yeah, and who gains from a prosecution?
Prosecution.
Who gains from
it's
a prosecution?
Who gains from the prosecution?
And I put in the chat box earlier, and I think it's one of an old phrase, and it's also something that Alex uses. Take your filthy laws off my body. To a certain extent, there is, and I will give you some links around this. There's the thing of what right does the state have to, come in and look at what goes on in the privacy of somebody's bedroom? How can you put that into a legal context?
You just never had sex with a prosecutor standing in the doorstep, watching. It could be fun. You don't know, right? Or the judge sitting there like, or the defense lawyer, I object, Your Honor. Yeah. It's obviously nonsense. But anyway, guys, we have 32 minutes left. Would you allow me do the EECA stuff, which is going to link somehow the conversation, and then also maybe put some more focus on how do we change the status quo, and how do we advocate, and how we also participate and make sure that in individual cases we can do something.
Yes, Timur, you can, as long as you leave me time at the end to play us all a video and give a blurb, an advert for HJN, and take you into some of the things that you can see on our website.
Sure, I will try to make it within 10 to 12 minutes. So in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and Poland is probably also part of that heritage, we had in Soviet times, Russian Federation passing the first law, adding the crime of exposing someone to HIV and transmitting HIV. And then obviously all other socialist republics, they just copy pasted that because that was Soviet Union. And it was about knowingly exposing someone to the threat of HIV or even AIDS, and then transmitting AIDS to someone, which is still the language in a couple of countries, which tells you how much advanced we are, right? We're still transmitting AIDS, not HIV. So anyway, and even though it's been 30 years since the Soviet Union collapsed, our laws are largely the same. So we still have the same language. We still have this knowingly, which is not even explained in the code. It's not, because we have intent, right? It can be direct intent when you want to do something and you want, the crime to happen and something to happen at the end, or it may happen, but you just don't stop it, don't prevent it, which is like indirect intent, but it has nothing to do with knowing. And we have that knowingly exposing someone appear in the article, and a lot of lawyers are actually saying that it means intent, which is bullshit. It doesn't mean intent. There is difference between wanting and knowing, right? So that's where we are. We have these laws which are obsolete, which come from the time when people even didn't have a clue what HIV is and proper information how it's transmitted. And we still, the only big change that happened in Eastern Europe is, just as I said, it's adding that clause about informed consent, which is, again, helps some, but is unhelpful in other respects. However, this being said, it looks like there is a movement towards decriminalization. And the region is a proper clusterfuck, I would say, because two of the region's countries are the leaders of criminalization in the world, Belarus and Russia, champions, criminalizing as crazy, very efficiently, effectively, like they're doing amazing job implementing their laws. I wish they were doing as good job building democracy, but that's a different topic. But anyway, now there is pressure, there is push to get rid of this criminalizing laws. And actually what helps is, in our region, in our legal systems, we have Supreme Courts come up with these decisions, which are usually called resolution of the plenum. And plenum is part of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is a bunch of very experienced judges, right? Like the best of the best, as they think. And the plenum is the best of the best of the best, right? So the plenum is like the smartest judges in the country. And they would do the following. They would publish this resolution, which would speak about practice or jurisprudence on a certain type of cases. They can do it on cases related to any issue. They can take any article of the criminal or civil or other code or family code, for example, and they can just interpret and give guidance to all judges, all courts in the country, how to deal with that category of cases. And no single country has that resolution on HIV exposure, transmission, or non-disclosure. So now we have Supreme Court of Tajikistan, which is one of the countries that is going to be a leader in criminalization very soon, because their law enforcement realized it's a very easy type of cases. So the courts are actually like, okay, we need to do something. And the Supreme Court is like, we have to do something about it. So when we had the second regional judges forum, the Supreme Court of Tajikistan was co-sponsoring that event. And they are considering to do this resolution of the plenum on cases related to HIV exposure and transmission. So that they say that basically, like, if the person is undetectable and on ARVs, the person should not be criminalized. So that should be the guidance to the judges. And we hope that, it always takes one country to be the first one. And that's how it happens with that clause, for example, about informed consent. Once Russia did it, then Belarus did it, then others did it, So we hope that it will be as infectious, and this plenum resolution will become a very important tool, because yes, the laws are bad. But the worst thing is that the way they're applied is even worse. So we need to make sure that the courts, the prosecution, doesn't go further than what the law is saying. So what we hope is that Tajikistan, hopefully over the course of this year, this amazing judge that we have here in Tajikistan, he attended one of the meetings of the African Judges Forum, and he became like, oh my God, so I didn't even have a clue, right? So now he's like a big champion. And he just decided, okay, I will just review all the case law that we had in the country on HIV. And he did this entire monitoring, something that actually should be the system. It should be done by Supreme Court regularly, or there should be like even an automated system when all these decisions are uploaded to the website. Like in Ukraine, they have a server where all these decisions can be found. Any case ruling would be on that portal. In Tajikistan, it wasn't like that. So this poor judge, he had to deal with hundreds of cases of HIV exposure and transmission. And he realized that the situation is really bad. And now they're preparing that resolution, the plenum resolution. When they do it, hopefully we will be able to use it as an advocacy tool in other countries as well. So we will make sure that with terrible laws which need to be changed, we at least have guidance for judges, which is telling them, okay, you don't need to overdo it, all right? You just, you guys hold on, just hold off yourself, just hold back. Hopefully that's going to help in the region and maybe even beyond. Another thing that I wanted to mention is how you can participate probably in courts. Every single country in Eastern Europe and Central Asia allows NGO representatives to be engaged one way or another, either as a public defender or as a defense witness. But in any case, that person could basically be all the time in the courtroom participating. And usually, who knows most about HIV? It's HIV doctors and HIV activists, right? So having an HIV activist in the courtroom all the time, whenever the prosecutor is starting some bullshit, that guy will just say, Your Honor, this is bullshit, and that really helps. For example, in our region, now they start using phylogenetic analysis. What is phylogenetic analysis? This is something we haven't mentioned, but this is an important tool which is being used by prosecution everywhere where it's available. It's basically proving that the strain, the strain of the virus in the defendant and in the victim is the same, which proves guilt of the defendant. And there are limitations. First of all, that strain could also be in hundreds of other people living in that area. This is something that they did in Belarus. When the prosecutor said that, okay, this is the proof, the activists who were public defenders in the case, they said, actually, we want to ask the expert. And the expert answered, no, actually, that's the strain which is in 80% of people living with HIV in that area. So this is no proof, and it could not be used as proof. And that's what also the consensus statement is saying. You cannot use it as a proof of guilt. What you can use it is a proof of innocence. If strains are different, then obviously this is definitely the defendant is not guilty. So this is what it can be used for. But otherwise, phylogenetic analysis in no way will be sufficient evidence to prove anyone's guilt. It has to be supported by other evidence. Because even if the strain is the same and it's like 99.99% same strain, it can be person A infecting person B, or person B infecting person A, as in one of the cases which was mentioned earlier, or person C infecting both person A and person B, right? It's just, you can't prove it. So this is something that you always have to be cautious about. Like when you see prosecution and they love it, they always bring it, and the experts don't bother explaining usually in the court when they present the results. Always be mindful, and whenever they raise this as an evidence, you just say, objection, Your Honor, this is bullshit. And that's going to be accepted because that's bullshit. And you're going to have evidence to prove that. Another thing that you can do is in cases when you're participating as a defender, refer to international guidelines, even if they're not mandatory, if they're not standards, even if it's just guidelines or publications or just articles, consensus statement, use them, refer to them, refer to the statement, to the report of the special rapporteur on the right to health, who was saying that criminalization should be banned, HIV should not be criminalized. Refer to the publications that were done by other UN agencies. And also what folks from Belarus did, they actually wrote a letter to WHO country office and asked to say what was the risk if the person was on ARVs and had undetectable viral load, and WHO came back with a response saying like the risk is minimal, so you cannot accuse someone in HIV exposure if the person, so that person was actually I think either acquitted or they just had this very symbolic, the person didn't end up paying anything or going to jail, though I think conviction was still, the criminal record was still there. But that's another issue. Like sometimes even judges cannot go beyond what they're allowed to. And in some countries, you just cannot acquit. In my country, if you acquit someone, you're not a judge. Tomorrow you wake up, you're not a judge anymore. Like it's prohibited. So, and the last thing that I want to say in terms of like how to advocate, first of all, you don't need to be an advocate of criminalization. Whenever you fight stigma, you fight criminalization. Whenever you fight discrimination, you fight criminalization. Whenever you debunk myths about HIV and people living with HIV and key populations, you fight criminalization. So just do whatever it takes to fight stigma. The less stigma in the society, the less likely some asshole in the parliament will want to criminalize. And actually, the more likely it is when HIV is not criminalized, the more likely it is you will have a champion in the parliament who could be an asshole but still likes popularity, you know. He can say, we need to decriminalize HIV. This is no longer, like HIV is not a crime. You know, you will end up having that when stigma goes down, when it's no longer popular to prosecute people, to blame and scapegoat people living with HIV. So probably I would stop here and let Julian do whatever he was planning to do. Thank you. But if you have any questions, please let me know. And yes, guys, we do need a civil society call to UNDP. So if you want, we can work together. Maybe EATG could do that. Could join the call. Maybe we need a joint call of several organizations, HIV Justice Network. Like we need this call coming to UN agencies saying like guidance is outdated. Did I sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger right now?
Yes, you did. Outdated, honey. It's outdated. You know,
It's always nice to see a bit of activism in the middle of a training session. Very welcome.
The Terminator.
Activism in action.
to bring us back to another thing, we started this off as, you know, this is not just, it is, but it isn't just around the criminalisation of non-disclosure, exposure and transmission. It brings us back to HIV Justice Worldwide, global coalition that campaigns to abolish criminal and similar laws, policies and practice that regulate, control and punish people living with HIV. And I think that, you know, what we know is the law is disproportionately used against those who the state feels it needs to control through morality, through nationalism, and things like that. And I think that one of the things, even in the countries where there is no law, criminal or otherwise, that criminalizes people with HIV, what we still know is that people living with HIV are responsible for carrying the burden of educating everybody that they come into contact with almost about HIV, you know, about having to disclose and making sure that the burden of everything that goes on is on their shoulders rather than sex being a shared responsibility. And I think there is as we talked earlier, one of the things about disclosure or disclosure of somebody's HIV status is that even if it isn't illegal not to disclose one's status before having sex, it is still expected that you will do it with your sexual partner. Why is that? No? That it's not a shared type of decision. I think that organizations could turn around and say, maybe you can assume that the person you pick up, the person you see might be HIV positive. Don't assume that they're not. You know, shifting the burden of educating people in the bedroom around sexuality, so that the person that you don't feel suddenly, you didn't tell me, so we can't have a relationship after the thing, you lied to me.
Yuri, I have a question.
Yeah.
Quick one. So I don't you think that is a bit because of U is not acknowledged publicly by any country in many countries, and which means that people also are not educated, which means that they're still complaining, and then and if there was more U was more publicly acknowledged, that there will be no defendant and no victims, and then those judges will not have really a case. Absolutely,
Elliot, and you say it better than me in some ways, because I think there is still this thing of even though it's not illegal, even though transmission might not take place, there is still that thing of to what extent do we feed into the idea that well, of course, you ought to be open about your HIV status if you're entering into a relationship with me. And because you lied to me about your HIV status, even though there was no possibility of transmission, there was no possibility of anything else, I can't have a relationship with you because we started this off on a false basis. And I think we need to think about that as well. I was going to ask to Marianne, if you can, to play the little 2-minute video of HIV Justice Worldwide.
HIV criminalisation remains an urgent problem happening in various situations all over the world. It's an ineffective public health tool, an affront to human rights, and it perpetuates stigma against people living with HIV.
In Canada, a woman living with HIV who had an undetectable viral load was put on trial for aggravated sexual assault for briefly letting a man perform oral sex on her.
In Malawi, a woman living with HIV was prosecuted for breastfeeding.
In Texas, there's a man with HIV who's in prison for 35 years for spitting at a cop.
In the US, a woman living with HIV was raped. She was so afraid of being prosecuted for not disclosing her HIV status to her rapist that she decided not to report it to the police.
In 2016, 7 civil society networks from around the globe, most of them led by people living with HIV, launched the HIV Justice Worldwide Coalition to coordinate a global response to the unjust use of laws against people with HIV.
Amnesty International is really pleased that this movement exists to support people who are facing human rights violations as a result of HIV criminalization.
UNAIDS supports this movement because ending HIV criminalization is a human rights imperative and a precondition for ending the global AIDS epidemic.
AIDS-Free World is really excited to be a part of HIV Justice Worldwide. It's bringing like-minded organizations together to collaborate and work on ending discriminatory laws that target people with HIV.
We at AIDS Action Europe are very happy to join this movement. We have all the science and evidence supporting us. It is high time to end this injustice globally.
To end HIV criminalization, we need you and thousands of others to join the movement.
We need to hear from you. Tell us what's going on in your country, in your community.
Sign up to the listserv, the place to share, to organise and to mobilise.
Get others engaged. It will take all of us.
I really love that energetic Lynette, who's my cousin from another mother and another.
One of the things I say in some ways, what we didn't want to do in this presentation was to go through the laws in the country. We wanted to have a conversation, but I think that the resources on there, and if you look at if you could just show the laws in Europe, Marina, a little table of laws.
While we're waiting for that, we'll have a minute's silence for Julian's hairdo in that video, and because you're gorgeous, love.
Good, darling. Can we do that, Marina? That's just a table with the. I put in the chat. Can you all see that? If you, I've gone to Eastern Europe first of all, and if you look at all of these, you will see how many of them have an HIV specific law. In other words, particular damage, HIV, not under the general law. And also look at the ones that have not only an HIV specific law, but it can also be prosecuted under the general law. And the other thing that we haven't, or under the sexually transmitted infection laws, and then just look at HIV specific there, and then let's just get rid of that one, and then let's go to Western Europe. And if you look at Western Europe, you will see. I've done the numbers here. 26 countries, because some of them, like Liechtenstein, we really can't be bothered about, on Monaco. Sorry, very small, but 26 countries, only 2 have an HIV-specific law. Now, and I think the conversation that we were having about that is that, yes, if there's an HIV-specific law, why is there an HIV-specific law? Why is this singled out? If there is a general criminal law, how appropriate is the general criminal law to be used? And can we take it out of the remit of the general criminal law so it doesn't apply to it? It's, the Offences Against the Person Act 1868, is it really appropriate to use in relation to HIV and educating judges and prosecutors and such? The other thing that you will see here is that, as in Hungary and Sweden, that there are public health laws, and we have concentrated here upon the fact of the criminal law. But as Lisa said very much earlier, there might be public health regulations, right, of the way that things happen, which is very difficult to challenge on an individual basis, can be just as punitive in terms of requiring isolation, of controlling people more. So the public health regulation that says you must inform all your sexual partners, right? The public health regulation that that says you can be quarantined. It's not part of it, and things like that. So I think in each country, even if you don't have a criminal law, or you think that this is all over, look at, if you want to follow up on this, look at are there public health regulations in the way that people who are living with HIV are controlled effectively are around fear, ignorance, and panic, rather than anything else. And if you go onto the HIV Justice website, you can see for every country the criminal law, the public health regulations, how many times we know there have been cases. Also, next to it, you will see, and it's a beautiful database, even though I do say so myself, you will see all of the cases in terms of both media reports and what we've said about the cases in a continuous news feed. And picking up on Simon's point about, we do not, when we see a case law, Joe Bloggs infects 27 women from Poland to Scotland, we redact the information, right? We talk about the elements of the case. We do not want to fuel by the renaming and the reshaming. So I think that's also quite a good resource. And we also look at and we will make comment upon it sometimes. And we will also say, well, what has been the reaction of civil society organizations? What have been the things, what people might be able to do as advocacy? And you will also see the organizations in each country which say that they're working on the issue. So another resource, if you want to get involved. On the HIV Justice Worldwide website, you will also see you can sign up to receive a newsletter, which will give you the COVID news, which we haven't even talked about, and the important things that are happening globally in the world of HIV criminalization from around the world. There are some pretty maps, very pretty cool, and more of fabulous videos like that that might look at in different jurisdictions, especially from people who are most impacted. This is what it did to me, for having sex with a guy once in a Louisiana bar, and suddenly I was on a sex offenders list for 7 years, and I had to spend a year in jail for one act of sex, where no transmission took place. So that was just the blurb for HIV Justice Network and HIV Justice Worldwide, which is our thing. And I will put together a whole lot of resources afterwards, but I do hope that you've enjoyed this as a conversation rather than death by PowerPoint. And the glorious Timur, my friend from Uzbekistan, wanted to, I'm giving the floor over.
What does HIV justice does when, for example, a hospital discriminate a patient, for example? What do you do?
What we will do is that we will document the fact that it's happening. If somebody comes to us and says, says it's happened to me, we will try and put somebody in contact with the local organization that ought to have better ought to be able to help better, but we will document the fact that it's happening, so we've got the body of evidence. In very few cases, HIV Justice Network actually provides small grants to organizations who are fighting those discrimination cases. For example, we're working in Kenya, supporting a lawyer to overthrow a law. We're working in Taiwan for them to overthrow a law. But in the main, we do not get, but the partners, should, of HIV Justice Network, should be able to do more on a local level. Our job in some ways is collecting all the information together so other people can see how it was dealt with somewhere else and what they might do about it, because knowledge. Well, to what extent are these problems happening and what are they impacting? And that's why Lisa and I started this whole bloody thing off in 2003 when everybody was talking about, it's criminalisation happening all over Europe. But nobody could tell you actualities. So we sat down and with the help of hundreds of people, asked them, what is going on? Let's look at the body of evidence. Timur and my love.
Julia, do you also work together with the College van Recht voor Mensen in the Netherlands? Do you work together?
No, but pass the information along to me. Yeah, because it's always useful, to get other people involved in that sort of thing.
I will be in touch. No problem.
Thank you, my love. Timur, my love.
Yes, one thing. It's very unfortunate that HIV Justice Network does not have funds to have basically like people hired to do research country by country. If you look at the criminalization scan, for example, you can see that some information is outdated. For some countries, it's not available. It would be good to have hired stuff. So, money is important. There should be like some fundraising, and maybe one reason why we have this HIV criminalization not as considered as a hot potato as it should, every time we're having high-level meeting on HIV or UNGAS, every time criminalization of key populations just takes over the entire agenda. And HIV criminalization never gets to the political declaration where it belongs. It should be there. We never succeeded to have anything in the political declaration on decriminalizing HIV. And I think that's a very big problem.
Yeah.
So
what I will say to you as well, I quite agree with this conversation we could have. I think one of the other things is that what we try and do as HIV Justice Network is be honest and true about the deficiencies in our information, which is always going to be a little bit out of date, rather than do what our website gets updated every day, rather than, and I think this is a general lesson for advocacy, isn't it? Rather than doing the research, spending another year writing the research, putting it out as as a definitive thing in 2019 based on 2015, saying it's been signed up to and it's a UN best study practice and all the rest of it, and then number one, it's out of date by the time it's bloody well produced. Yeah, and number two, it almost, because the data's not out there, you can't start to address the issue as it happens. And that's the difference between advocacy and academia, and to a certain extent, the difference between advocacy and NGO organizations, rather than the supranationals, right, which shape things in a different and very slow way, and a lot of the times are working behind the curve. But that's just because I'm an activist, and I'm not sitting in Geneva.
Yeah.
Finally finish, because we are 3 minutes over.
Sorry,
right?
Julian. There was one thing about non-disclosure that we didn't actually mention. We spoke about non-disclosure to partners, but we didn't speak about non-disclosure to doctors, because actually everywhere in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, people are obliged to tell every doctor they come in contact with that they're HIV positive. And if they don't, they're not prosecuted for non-disclosure, they're prosecuted for exposure. So that's one other element that we didn't mention.
Yes, absolutely.
And one more thing is in terms of like you may when Julian was showing me, sorry, the last thing, when Julian was showing the table with specific laws, non-specific laws, there is a big harm in specific and HIV specific laws, because if you get convicted for an HIV specific crime, then fuck confidentiality. There's going to be no confidentiality. Everyone will know, because that's the article you were charged with. Everybody will know your entire life, because they just keep it. They just keep the criminal record forever.
Thank you, Timur. I'm going to give the last word to Lisa if she wants to say anything.
All I want to say is thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you for your patience. I hope you found something useful in this, and feedback is very welcome.
Thank you. We recorded it. There will be a lot of lists, but I'm sure that Lisa, I, and Timur, if you have a specific thing, get back to us. We're here by email. I look forward to seeing you all for Stigma and Discrimination next Tuesday. And because you've had such a nice time here, I'm going to bore you to death with PowerPoint. No, I'm not. Look forward to seeing you, and I will be sending out to all participants a little exercise to think about before the thing on stigma and discrimination on Tuesday. If you have time to look at it, it'll kick the conversation off. Bye to everybody, and have a fabulous weekend. Okay?
Yep. Bye-bye, everyone.